This is the fourth of a series of webinars on the evaluation process. If you haven't already, it would be useful to watch the Introduction to Evaluation, Planning Your Intervention and Doing Your Intervention webinars. You might also like to download or print a copy of the handout from our website, which has the key information from this webinar to save you from having to take lots of notes. This webinar will cover how to choose which intervention you are going to evaluate, steps to evaluate your intervention, how to review your aims, objectives and logic model, how to decide what to measure, and the costs of carrying out an evaluation. The first stage of planning an evaluation is of course deciding which project you are actually going to evaluate. If you're involved in a number of road safety interventions that have not been evaluated previously, you will need to decide which one you will evaluate first, because it will be really expensive and time consuming to evaluate them all at once, and in reality you are unlikely to have the resources to do this. If you are struggling to decide which project it is best to evaluate first, there are a number of factors you can consider which might help you to decide. Firstly, it will be worth thinking about where you need to find out information about a project the most. For example, you might like to select an intervention that costs the most money to run, or an intervention that takes up a lot of staff time in delivery. However, if you haven't evaluated a project before, it might be best to stick to an educational training project. This is because it is much more difficult to access the audience of a publicity campaign and to determine its effects. Although it is best practice to think about an evaluation when you are planning your intervention, you can still evaluate projects that are up and running, and the process is very similar to that of a new intervention. However, if you do want to evaluate after planning the intervention, you will need to go back and check your planning. This would include reviewing the aims and objectives and checking the evidence base of your work. For example, ideally you will need to demonstrate that the intervention is needed and that the approach you have taken to delivering the intervention has been successful in the past. This might seem time consuming, but it will allow you to remind yourself of what the project aimed to achieve and also to make any necessary changes. If you are still planning your intervention, it would be advisable to build an evidence base by doing some research first. So, you could check local casualty and collision data to make sure that the road safety issue you would like to address is a priority. If it is, you could look at other research and evaluation reports to find out what interventions have worked for others. You should be careful when reading evaluation reports, as some reports might claim that a project was a success on the basis that it reached a large number of people. You must remember that this does not prove whether the content was effective. Places you could look for evidence include Google Scholar, the Road Safety Observatory, Road Safety GB Knowledge Centre, TRL, ORSA for managing occupational road risk case studies, and the reports section of the Evaluate website. If you do find a really useful article, it can be helpful to follow up relevant reports that are cited directly in the text or bibliography, as these can help you to form a stronger evidence base for your intervention. If you are evaluating an existing intervention, you will also need to go back and review your goals, aims, objectives and logic model, and if you are planning a new intervention, you will need to set some up. Writing your goals, aims and objectives is not an easy process, as they need to be thought through very carefully. You will need to write them and review them yourself. It would also be ideal for someone else to review them too, especially if you need others who are part of the project to agree to them. Sometimes you might find it quite easy to think of a goal for your project, but it could be harder to think in detail about the objectives. To help with this, you should go back to each objective you write and check that it meets the SMART criteria. You will also need to do this whenever you alter the objectives. If you haven't designed one already, designing a logic model can sound like a really daunting task. However, it is actually just a project plan that allows you to check if your intervention has any chance of achieving what you want it to. It is usually set out on a single piece of paper, and is a trail from what you put into the road safety intervention to what you want to get out of it. So, if you would like more information on how you can design a logic model, it would be useful for you to watch the Doing Your Intervention webinar. Once you have clear aims and objectives and a logic model, you can start to consider what you would like to measure during your evaluation. Basically, what measurements you are going to take during your evaluation will depend on what you are looking to achieve from it. If you want to measure if your project is effective in increasing knowledge or improving attitudes and behaviour, you would measure outcomes. However, if you want to see if improvements could be made to the design and delivery of your intervention, you would measure the outputs of your project. If you want to measure the effectiveness of your project, you would measure outcomes. In short, outcomes are the effect of your road safety intervention. This could include a change in attitudes, behaviour or knowledge. The outcomes you are going to measure will relate to the aims and objectives of your project. By measuring these, you will be able to see if you have achieved the aims and objectives of your intervention, and if you look at your logic model, you should get the predicted outcomes of your intervention. So, you might want to focus on measuring the effectiveness of a road safety intervention if you have done some testing and already know what the intervention is going to look like, or if the intervention has already been delivered for some time. There are several ways in which you can measure the effectiveness of your intervention. But be warned that although an overall goal of your project might be to reduce casualty rates, analysing casualty data is unlikely to be an appropriate measure to determine the effectiveness of your project. This is because you cannot pinpoint whether and how much of the reduction in casualty rates was due to your project. To link an intervention to a reduction in casualties, you would need a really large-scale evaluation carried out over a long period of time run under the conditions of a scientific trial. Instead of analysing casualty data, it would be useful to identify outcome measures that could contribute to a reduction in road traffic collisions. Some outcomes you could consider measuring are a change in attitudes, for example towards speeding, a change in behaviour, for example more regular vehicle safety checks, or an increase in knowledge, for example of the risks of not wearing a seatbelt. It is important to remember that these measures should be specific and directly related to the aims and objectives of your intervention. As I mentioned in the Doing Your Intervention webinar, some external factors might also make a difference to the effectiveness of your project, and therefore it can be difficult to attribute changes in attitudes, knowledge or behaviour to your project. To make your findings more reliable, you could use multiple outcome measures. To measure the effectiveness of a project, you will also need to use before measurements, known as baseline data, to understand the level of knowledge or existing attitudes or behaviour that someone had regarding a road safety issue before the workshop. This also provides a measure to compare any changes to after the workshop. It is always important to start from where people really are in terms of their knowledge, attitudes or behaviour, and not where we think they are, as it could be wrong to assume that people start from zero. For example, if you are delivering a workshop on the dangers of drink driving, collecting baseline data will allow you to understand how much people already know about drink driving. It could be wrong to assume that people know nothing, as they are likely to have gained some knowledge from other interventions, such as publicity campaigns on drink driving. It is also important to note that baseline data might have already been collected for another purpose, and this should be considered before you decide to collect new data. This is always worth considering because it could save you a lot of time and effort. Finally, you will need to consider whether you would like to collect data on short or long-term outcomes, or both. Short-term outcomes are the effects you see immediately after the intervention. For example, in education programs or publicity campaigns, these outcomes could be changes in awareness levels, knowledge and understanding, or a change in attitude. In training programs, there might be changes in skill development that can be observed. Long-term outcomes are the effects of the project that continue over longer periods of time. So, at this point, the audience will have had time to put what they have learned into practice, and you can test to see if they've done so. You can also measure if any changes in knowledge or attitudes have been sustained over time. Measuring effectiveness might not be the aim of your evaluation. Instead, you might like to measure how you can improve the delivery of your intervention, and to do this, you might measure outputs. An output is something that is produced by the project, such as good practice guidelines or an activity such as a workshop or driver training course. By measuring outputs, you will be able to see any changes that need to be made to your intervention. For example, measuring outputs might mean reporting the number of driver training courses you have delivered, which could highlight that there is a lack of courses taking place in a particular location. An evaluation of programme processes might involve assessing the management of an intervention, including delivery and cost efficiency, assessing staffing requirements and the training of staff, examining how the programme was implemented, investigating to what extent the target group was reached, and finally, it could also include using monitoring data such as the number of workshops delivered, the scale of audience reached, or the costs of running the intervention. If your project is quite new, you might like to do a small-scale test to see if you can improve the design or delivery of your intervention. This will help you to decide if any amendments need to be made before you roll out your project further. It is important to note at this point that measuring outputs cannot determine whether your project is effective. So, just because something has been delivered on a large scale or for a long period of time does not prove that it is effective, as it might not have been delivered well. It is likely that you will want to measure the effectiveness of a project and to improve the design and delivery. This is fine and can all be built into one evaluation. It is important to evaluate road safety interventions, as an evaluation determines whether these projects offer value for money and whether they are effective in achieving their aims and objectives. However, evaluating a project does cost money. This means that when you are planning your intervention, a budget does need to be set aside for evaluating the project, and if you are applying for funding, you should include the cost of evaluation in your proposal. Organisations such as the Big Lottery Fund and the DFT suggest setting aside around 10% of the budget for the evaluation of your project. In this webinar, we have covered how to choose which intervention to evaluate, reviewing aims, objectives and logic models, what to measure in your evaluation, and finally, the cost of evaluation. If you have any questions about anything that we have covered in this webinar, you can email me at rneedham@rospa.com. I hope you found this webinar useful. There are 10 more webinars covering each stage of the evaluation process on the help and guidance page of our website.